I'm here, as Blaine said, like I've spent the last 18 months looking at climate misinformation online, in print and in broadcast kind of media. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about a project called Act for Climate Truth. So we've been going for about 8 months, and we are essentially a network of organisations on a mission to kind of get ahead of climate misinformation. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about what climate misinformation is. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, kind of like how we can actually take practical steps to tackle it. And I've got a short presentation for you. We'll have Q&A afterwards and a nice discussion. I can't see your faces on the chat, unfortunately, so don't worry, we will give you a chance to kind of ask questions and interrogate some of the information. And thank you for kind of coming along today. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about something called the Big Tobacco Playbook, what we can expect from misinformation in 2022, and then we're going to talk to you a little bit about reframing, because I think it's really, really important to understand a little bit about how we can actually fight back. Don't want to leave you with just problems. So for any of us who are communicating around climate, we know that misinformation is rife. Particularly in the British press recently, we've had this huge attack on net zero. We've had kind of organisations misrepresenting, in fact, in the wake of the energy crisis, what kind of green levies, for example, consumers pay. We have our regular kind of attacks on activists. People like Greta Thunberg, unfortunately, are subject to some quite frequent attacks, some of them really misogynistic in nature. And we kind of, and we see them all day-to-day, things like the kind of climate change is a hoax and you can't trust the science. But all of these things can be hard to categorise and can be hard to kind of understand. What is misinformation? Kind of how can we make sure that we preserve the need to debate some of the solutions around climate change? And how can we ensure that we kind of, making sure that we have good debates around these things, whilst also not necessarily getting sucked into debates around things like the science, for which we know that there's a scientific consensus. So part of what our organisation has been doing is actually looking at how we can create a universal definition of climate misinformation. And this is one that's been developed with a huge group of, I think, 25 other organisations who are experts in misinformation in climate space. So just for reference, how we refer to climate misinformation is that it's deceptive or misleading content that either undermines the science, the existence or the impacts of climate change, and the need for corresponding urgent action, or that misrepresents scientific data. So that can be things like leaving stuff out, cherry picking in order to kind of create a story that sounds plausible but in fact isn't, in order to erode trust in the climate science, institutions, experts and solutions, or finally, falsely publicises efforts as supportive of climate goals, that in fact contribute to climate warming, or that contravene the scientific consensus on mitigation or adaptation. So for those of you that work in things like greenwash, for example, you'll recognise that perhaps actually some of these kind of greenwashing claims fall quite heavily under number 3. So that's how we define climate misinformation, and we're doing a lot of work to make sure that legislators and others kind of actually come to adopt this definition. So I'm going to talk to you a lot today about something called the Big Tobacco Playbook. And for anyone that's listened to, this is quite a popular topic in podcasts at the moment. We're seeing this model applied to things like sugar, agriculture, and kind of big industries. But essentially, this playbook has been around since about the 1950s, when Big Tobacco realised that it needed to come up with a PR plan to save its reputation, because there was a lot of science out there at the time that said, you know what, smoking is terrible for you. Tobacco has a strong link to cancer. And so rather than accepting the science and doing something about it, Big Tobacco decided to invest in a load of PR techniques that meant that they could continue to continue with their business as usual. So they did this in a number of ways, and for those of you that are already communicating around climate, you might see a few things that kind of translate across. So what they did is they focused on promoting personal responsibility. So it's actually the responsibility of the smoker, to make sure that they don't make themselves ill. Instilling doubt in science. So could we be sure that these studies actually did prove the link between smoking and cancer? They also lobbied with their enormous resources to make sure that the government didn't take action when they felt they should have done. And they also said, don't worry about it, we've got this in hand. We're going to make self-regulatory pledges, we're going to introduce safer products, and we're going to solve the problem ourselves. Or they just flat out denied that any of this was their fault. So that was actually super effective, and these kind of things have been picked up by the oil and gas industries. So the big tobacco playbook itself, it's not just communications. There's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes. So, for example, the organisations might conduct counterfeit science that suggests that actually the consensus maybe isn't right. They might buy credibility through alliances with academic institutions, with professional institutions, or they might actually kind of pay a lot of money to manipulate government officials to make sure that actually policies don't outright ban their products, or actually don't make the moves that they should do in order to solve the problem. And obviously this happened with tobacco. We've seen, for those of you that saw the excellent report by Greenpeace into just the amount of lobbying that was kind of going that goes on around kind of making sure that oil and gas aren't regulated in the way that perhaps they should be. So, if when we look forward, we looked at the big tobacco playbook at COP26, and I think this is very much kind of carries for the big tobacco playbook in 2022. It's got some kind of key tactics that we should be aware of. So the first of which is called the Blitz. This is taken from a term from the Union of Concerned Scientists. And basically this is about harassing scientists or activists, anyone that speaks out, ad hominem attacks, painting them as hysterical, as ridiculous, and trying to discredit them. The second one is the Diversion. So this is around manufacturing uncertainty around science or indeed solutions. So any of you that have been working in net zero recently, or or are working on that transition from the energy transition in response to the energy crisis will have seen this. Can we be sure that heat pumps work? Are renewables really going to power our entire country? That kind of stuff. And then finally, you've got the culture war. So actually, rather than attacking people or attacking the science, you could just pit groups of people against each other. And this is often done by telling one group that something is unfair, they're having something taken away, or that another group is trying to tell them what to do. So let's look into these in more detail. I think the most famous kind of blitz from COVID was kind of looking at kind of Neil Ferguson and how he was targeted with some rather nasty stories about his personal life when he was trying to lead. He was suggesting that we should stay in lockdown. We also see them regularly against Greta Thunberg, often, unfortunately, from male commentators. We had a male commentator suggest that she should have her bottom slit, for example. This is just about discrediting the people and other figures who are speaking out against this, against the status quo. Next, you've got the diversion. So, manufacturing uncertainty about existing science. This is so dangerous because it confuses people. And it, particularly when we need both political and public mandates for climate action to make sure that it happens, the diversion is a very, very effective tactic. So, for example, quite recently we had the kind of CO2 shortages, and there were that were brought about by the kind of the lack of hauliers and issues with kind of getting these products into the UK from Europe. And there were a lot of commentators attempting to draw parallels with, kind of climate change and say, actually, how can we have a shortage of CO2 when we also have a change in climate? And they're telling us these two things. So these things confuse people, and they affect the ability of us to maintain our public mandate. Next, we have the culture war. So anyone that is working in, anyone that's working in net zero right now will have seen this. Unfortunately, we have a lot of, we're seeing increasing numbers of these hypocrites narratives, where we're pitting groups against each other in the media. So this might be telling one group that eco-hypocrites are trying to tell you what to do whilst they're flying to COP. This might be a group telling you, okay, hang on a second, you know, these people actually don't have your best interests at heart. It might be saying, look, you know, kind of, we've seen it with the net zero things. Actually, these eco-hypocrites want to leave you cold and poorer in order to kind of push their green agenda. So those culture wars are really, really dangerous because it can turn people off. They really are emotional, and they really, you know, kind of do make people distrust, you know, the public, you know, what we're trying to do. So there we go. We're expecting to see, you know, we expect these kind of narratives to continue, and we expect to keep seeing them, unfortunately, because they are super effective. You know, the one that we're seeing at the moment, I think, unfortunately, is this net zero referendum campaign. Luckily, it's not getting a lot of traction. Let's be clear, like, you know, this is actually most of the public aren't up for another referendum. We're not seeing a lot of traction online, but there might be a few of you out there who are kind of seeing it on the regular in your community management, for example. But this is a lot like a kind of long and ongoing kind of campaign to undermine net zero, undermine the policies. And there is an absolute kind of element of truth in all of this. I think the net zero policies do, you know, there usually is an element of truth in these narratives. The net zero policies currently, in the way that they're, you know, in the way that they will be delivered, could impact people on lower incomes. And so, you know, but what we cannot, you know, what we cannot necessarily get into conversations around is just rebutting this claim. So I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about some of the tactics that we can use to get ahead. Yeah, culture wars, again, we're seeing this kind of with Russia and you know, kind of at the moment with everything that's happening around the energy crisis. We've had it before with kind of China being held up as an organisation, as a kind of country that needs to move before the UK should do anything. You know, and we, you know, kind of like, we need to think about how we kind of use reframes to kind of actually move that conversation on. And as you know, we've talked about kind of Greta Thunberg and just how much you know, just how much abuse and hatred is coming her way. So how are we going to fight these how are we going to fight this? These are dirty tactics, and you know, for us, many of us, I think what we often get stuck into is a cycle of kind of responding to some of these frames. So we just end up in this point where we're actually just saying, well, actually, that's not true, and we've got the stats to say it. And the problem with getting stuck in that kind of dynamic is that actually people really respond to salient information, and they really respond to emotional information. They're not so interested in facts. So what happens is we need to think emotionally, and we need to kind of suggest communications, ways to respond and communicate in ways that are kind of have their roots in emotion. So the first one that I think we should think about are reframes. And this is a way of actually not just getting stuck, you know, just not answering into the frame that your opponents have set. It's about presenting the issue in a new way, which kind of leads with shared values and appeals to your target audience. We'll have a look at an example of that in a second. The second way that you can respond is definitely the rebuttals, countering misinformation with facts. But you've also got to couple that with emotions. There's a brilliant kind of technique called fact, myth, fallacy, which we're going to talk to you about in a second. And then finally, you can also kind of try and get ahead. So exposing ahead of time the myths that are going to be kind of perpetrated and making sure people are aware of just exactly why those myths are myths. So what does reframing mean? Well, actually, you can make reframes, you know, kind of like uplifting, inspiring, and positive, setting out a vision, you know, kind of rallying around an action. And as I said, reframes are all about presenting information in a new way. So if you remember, if you've been in climate change communications for a long time, you'll remember when we used to kind of frame a lot of climate change communications in terms of, like, you know, nature being destroyed, and you know, we talked about kind of the impact on animals. And over the last 5 years, we've started to look much more at kind of climate change's impact on our children, on things that are very kind of, you know, kind of personal to us, in order to frame it in a way that brings it closer to home. And kind of those that reframing can be positive, where you're taking these things in a positive direction, or they can be adversarial. And that the adversarial frames are about kind of pointing out what's wrong and helping people to kind of with the information that they're receiving, and kind of like helping them to reflect a little bit. And we always say this when we're talking about like some of our jargon, some of the things that mean a lot to us as an environmental movement mean nothing to ordinary people. So we always recommend that people use that kind of really straightforward language to do so. So here's an example of a couple of reframes, and the one on the left, the Dong Energy advert, I love, because this is about reframing our response to our energy generation away from wind turbines being this kind of undesirable foreign technology. At the time this advert came out, there were a lot of articles about how wind turbines were manufactured elsewhere, a lot of concern about the amount of kind of carbon within the manufacture and transportation of the wind turbines. And what this did is it just beautifully kind of represented wind turbines. This great British leadership showed that we could be kind of self-sufficient, and that actually Britain could really kind of have this homegrown energy, to lead the world. And that's a kind of positive reframe. And on the right, we've got a kind of adversarial reframe. So this was from ITV, when the kind of group Diversity did a dance that was kind of rooted in Black Lives Matter. And ITV received a lot of complaints. There was a couple of media outlets that tried to whip up controversy around this dance and saying it was too political, it shouldn't have been on kind of evening television. And so what ITV did is they used this effort to reframe and kind of double down on the fact that representation matters and that it was important that this story was told. So you can see there like how you can use reframes to kind of like get ahead of the conversation. And we've talked a little bit about the climate reframes, but this idea of climate justice is a kind of much more people-based reframe that's been used in recent years. We can think about kind of how climate change can bring about an abundance of opportunities for all, as opposed to kind of reframing it around kind of we've got to fix this enormous problem. The second thing you can use is this idea of rebuttals. So if you are going to rebut, and I think quite often we're in a situation where we have to counter the misinformation that we've seen, we should do this in a way that uses a fact myth fallacy model. So when a piece of misinformation reaches us, often it's really salient in some way. It's really shocking, or it's something that we are it's often really shocking, or it's something that has leads us to have a strong emotional reaction. So in fact, to get rid of that piece of misinformation, we need something that's just as sticky. So we need a replacement fact to offer an alternative explanation, so that can fit in whoever you're talking to's mental model. So we start by kind of talking about that. Then we repeat the myth, and we say, actually, this, like emphasizing the fact that it's false, and then we can explain why it's false. So, for example, I think you might this was an example of someone who was in my LinkedIn posts. I had posted something about kind of climate misinformation, and this person got back to me and said, there's no way that climate change is happening because there's still snow on Kilimanjaro. Fine. I mean, obviously, because there is still snow on Kilimanjaro, like all of this scientific work, all of the scientific consensus isn't happening. So actually, the way that I responded using this model was actually just to kind of to rebut them. So telling them that actually it's melting at an alarming rate, and I had a really good picture of this. And actually the killer thing here is that scientists think Kilimanjaro will be snow-free by 2033. So repeating the myth, and then actually just explaining to anyone who was listening in on this conversation that he's cherry-picking evidence. just because he climbed it and saw snow doesn't mean that the glacier is not melting away. And finally, you've got inoculation. I mean, this can be difficult for us to do, but I think just letting people know, letting people who haven't yet been exposed to misinformation, some of the things that they'll see. For example, at the moment, this might be talking about it might be kind of just saying, hey, there's a lot of conversation about green levies. Here's an explanation of actually how much you really are paying and how much you're saving. But then inoculation can be really helpful, because if people haven't already been exposed, when they are exposed to this misinformation, they have a frame of reference, and they can go, actually, I've heard that this isn't true. So that is a very quick canter through some of the climate misinformation that we're kind of currently seeing, and also some of the ways that you can respond. I know that I've gone through quite a lot of content quite quickly, so I think it would be great if we can just spend a little bit of time, kind of discussing, asking, feel free to ask me anything, and we can take it from there.
Great, thank you for that. That's very interesting. I had some links to the side there. So from the people who are online right now, because this is also going to be recorded, I guess if you have questions, please pop them in. If you, we can also bring you on screen if you want to actually talk. Just ping me on the chat on the side. So there's a comment here. It says, we're seeing a lot of these tactics being used in the context of the Ukraine crisis. For instance, farm lobbies are already winning battles in the EU to stop, delay, and relax any climate measures using the argument of food security, which is not supported by the actual truth. Do you want to have any comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're also seeing these narratives around energy security. So big things around actually, we must stop relying on kind of gas from kind of Russia, and therefore the answer to that is fracking. And I think it's so important, depending on who your audience is, whether you're going for a public mandate for change or a political mandate for change, to ensure that this audience not only has the facts, but that you frame this in a really compelling way. Food security, of course, is instantly emotional, because the idea of losing things of scarcity, etc., is very scary to individuals, and so they can be, when people are scared, they make it's easy for them to accept things like false dichotomies. So we can either have food security or we can have this green crap, and we can't have both, for example. So what I would suggest is that you then frame your information in a way that it's also is also emotional. So I would make sure you're being proactive, that the key stakeholders have the facts, but the facts are framed in a way that they can really, emotionally connect to. So that might be, kind of like long-term food security for future generations, or, kind of like that will ensure our children have food throughout their lifetime, relies on these things. And then you can actually frame, you can actually deal with the information through that frame. And then, kind of like, actually, if people are trying to rebut that and they're rebutting into your frame, they have to rebut the idea that, kind of like our children's kind of long-term, kind of like food security depends on that, for example. It may be that there's a different frame. It may be that there's different kind of levers that suit your context best. But I would definitely say it's not just about facts. It's also about, kind of the human benefit of doing the things that you want them to do.
Okay, great. Now we have another 2 questions that have come up. So how do you prevent the backfire effect from happening when you rebut false claims? I thought rebutting was generally unhelpful unless done in advance. Keen to understand the nuance here.
Yes, agreed. So John Cook and Stephen Lewandowski, who I have, there are links to in this presentation, and I will share this presentation with you. They did an investigation into the backfire effect, and their conclusion was that it is, thank you, Glenn, it is widely overstated. That's why the fact myth fallacy model is so important, because you can just imagine you're sitting around the dinner table, and you've got 2 people that disagree with each other on opposite ends of the dinner table, And basically they start to argue, and it's like, yes, it is, no, it isn't, yes, it is, no, it isn't. Everyone else around the dinner table is just switching off, and they're like, I'm just going to ignore these guys and hope that they stop. But if you are, if you are, and I think that's what you've slightly got to think about when you think about kind of this stuff happening in a social media context, or in a context where other people can hear, where in fact, sometimes the person that you're talking to, if they're really dyed in the wool, if they really believe something, you're not going to change their minds, but your audience is everyone else that's overhearing it. The fact this fallacy model is really, really powerful because it works with the way that the human brain works. If I if I've heard a piece of misinformation and I've internalized it and I've worked it into my own mental model of how the world works, to just try and remove it means that I'm left with a mental model with a hole in it. And we're human beings, we don't like that. We don't like, we don't like to admit that we're wrong, and we don't like to kind of like our mental models to be too disrupted. So that's where the replacement fact is a really good idea. And if you can make that replacement fact emotional and kind of salient, even better. Because then what happens is that fact gets replaced in their mental model in their brain. So, they still understand how the world works. It's just that little thing has been changed. And then also they understand that they've been taken for a ride. They understand that someone has given them this piece, why they've been lied to, basically. Is that cherry picking? And it helps them feel, it helps them kind of like not feel like they're wrong. And there's some brilliant YouTube content out there from John Cook on this, and he just explains this really, really well. And I think when you're thinking about the things that your audience care about, be that safety, security, adventure, whatever that is, even better to wrap up that replacement fact with something that that they really care about.
Great. And what was the name of that YouTube video producer? Was it?
Yeah. Can someone post a link to the John Cook videos? Absolutely. I think they're in my presentation.
I'll have Edna right behind me. I'll look it up and see if she can sort of make a few links to that.
John Cook, right?
Yes, Dr. John Cook. He's in a university in Australia, which one slightly escapes me. But.
Okay. So next, I guess, comment that becomes a question. In my view, the environmental movement sort of itself must reimagine, reframe itself as one that is also an information environment movement, as concerned about people and their information environments as the health of the physical world, nature, and ecosystems. Why have environmentalists been so late to this challenge, and what could speed up doing so?
I think, yeah, that's a really good question. And I used the example earlier on of, if you look at environmental comms from kind of 10, 15 years ago, you see a lot of landscapes and a lot of animals, and that is great. And, that really, really can help to reach particular people. But if, we did a survey years ago, and it was like, would you rather save, basically, in the grand scheme of things, would you rather cure, kind of terminal illness, or would you rather save the planet? And obviously, people say, well, I'd rather cure terminal illness, because I know, kind of like I've had a family member who's been extremely unwell and died, or etc. So we have to think about what is, kind of like what is kind of important to the largest number of people when we're communicating around that stuff, and that is generally other people. Let's be honest. And we've seen that kind of slowly happen. We've seen things like Fridays for the Future start to talk about the future of our families. On the flip side of things, we have big groups of people, particularly at the moment when the world is a very uncertain place, who are craving safety and security. And we also have this kind of, I talked a little bit about the Great British Energy frame to counter the energy crisis. A lot of people genuinely believe that we should be self-sufficient. They genuinely believe in kind of the power of a global Britain to solve some of these problems. And the problem is, I think, that when we think about who's in the environmental movement, who's interested in climate change, perhaps not so much conservation, they're different people. But if you think about climate change, this is a really big world problem that requires enormous change to fix it. And And so you have the kind of people that are really into big problems and change and, you know, kind of like, you know, the world as a whole. But they're only a particular section of the population. And I think the environmental movement, in my opinion, like, we need to get better at communicating with people who aren't like us. And we need to get much better at communicating with people in a way that's not climate first. So I think we also quite often assume that, you know, kind of like we should start with climate change because it's the most important thing. And for most people, actually, that's not the case. For most people, I don't know, they're, you know, job security might be their thing that really, you know, that they're really concerned about. It might be, you know, it might be just making sure that their local environment is, you know, kind of like is nice. You know, that might be where we should be starting from. And I think we've got to get better at not only talking to people who don't think that climate change is the most important thing, but also, you know, kind of working with, consulting with, recruiting people who think differently, and you know, kind of thinking about that. And I think, for example, the climate justice frame is a really, you know, kind of really, really strong, really interesting way of thinking about how you take, you know, you kind of mix climate and equality, you know, this kind of great British energy frame, you know, and self-sufficiency frame is a really interesting one, thinking about, you know, kind of how you talk to people for whom safety, security, and a kind of like, and a Great Britain is, you know, is the thing to lead with. So, yeah, we do. You're right, Rachel. We, you know, like we've kind of got to break down that good and evil kind of narrative that we've got, or thinking of, you know, about our own bubbles. But it's about kind of like, how can we take this, you know, kind of like, how can we make this work for everybody, and how can we kind of change our comms to do that? And the best thing about that is if we do that, we can get ahead of the misinformation, and we don't get stuck in that space where we're going, yes, it is, no, it isn't. You know, yeah. So, yeah. Oh, Dwayne, I think you're on mute.
Great. So the next question then is, how do you rebut a climate myth information or misinformation without unintentionally putting the myth in the spotlight? In a previous job at an NGO, we found people remembered the fake fact first, even if the context was being told it was fake.
Yeah. Okay. No, this is a really good point. So John Cook actually talks about this in his videos as well. And you know, I think we're currently working on using kind of like how you kind of like use really strong imagery and like really compelling messaging. We're trying to work out what words work, what images work for people to remember it. But that's why he also lays it out as fact, myth, fallacy. So you lead with the fact, and by leading with the fact, this is him. Yes, Rachel. Yeah. So like, if you lead with the fact, then, you know, like, people are able to, so they see that first, and then only when you've seen the fact, and preferably if it's wrapped up in something super salient, so it's rememberable, then you can repeat the myth, and then you explain why the myth is right. And hopefully, if you do it in that order, with that weighting on, you know, the importance of the message, then that's the thing that dislodges the false piece of information. Obviously, and I say this because it's like, you know, sometimes you can't change people's minds in one hit. Unfortunately, a lot of these misinformation narratives are play on frames that have been built up over a long time. So if we think about those frames, they might be things like, you know, going green is expensive, and so therefore net zero is going to cost us loads of money. You know, we've had the going green is expensive frame for years, and some, you know, they always have some truth in them. You might think about the, you know, kind of, I don't know, there's rich people are out for themselves, and they want to take things away from you, or people with power want to keep that power. You know, that kind of like, you know, kind of frame that we see in a lot of, you know, a lot of popular media, for example, in a lot of, you know, in historical, you know, kind of stories, etc. Well, then obviously, because powerful people want to keep their power, well, that's why these eco-hypocrites want us to do this. Like, they're not doing this. This is a way of keeping us down. So, you know, often unfortunately, this misinformation like plays into these limiting beliefs. It plays into these frames that have been set for a long, long time. And so, yes, you know, kind of just with one rebuttal, we're not always going to shift people's opinions, but we can collectively over time. And that's, you know, and that's also why getting ahead, creating these compelling narratives that lots of people buy into and are really supportive of, helps us get ahead, because then we start to set the frames, and then we start to, you know, kind of like own the conversation and not just responding to the frames that others have set.
Great, thank you for that. Now, I've got a question on my own. I was just typing in, but didn't get a chance to finish it when you finished. I've found that this type of, I guess, the misinformation, disinformation has been going on, especially noticeable for the last 5, 7, 8 years. I mean, it's always been a factor, but it really wasn't a factor in campaigning communication until quite recently. Do you have a a feeling of why that was? Why are we playing catch up so much to something that actually has always been around there?
Yeah, oh my gosh, yes. So we've always had misinformation. We have always had greenwashing that will tell us that coal is clean, and, you know, we'll have flowers coming out the back of, you know, tailpipes of kind of petrol cars. We've always had that stuff. And then we've always had, you know, kind of media outlets that would campaign against kind of green stuff. Like, I worked in the Energy Saving Trust press office in 2009 when the EU banned kind of like traditional style light bulbs. And, you know, some of the stuff that people were coming out with was amazing. Apparently, you know, we were all going to die from mercury poisoning because of these things. So we've always had that. But what we have always had with some of that is gatekeeping. So, you know, you'd have to have the money to create an advertising campaign to say that your coal is clean, or you'd have to have your editor sign off to write a piece of, to write an article to say that we were all going to die from these light bulbs. What we've got now is we've got and I think someone on the chat mentioned information ecosystems. We've got information ecosystems which have no gatekeeping. We have, for good or bad, like there's two sides to every story. We've got information ecosystems which prioritize, or have traditionally prioritized, attention and engagement. And that is a huge problem, because so much misinformation is really salient, it's really engaging. It's usually designed to shock us or to tell us that, you know, something that we believe is true. And, you know, there was a Harvard study a couple of years ago which found that misinformation rips through Twitter 6 times quicker than the truth. So, you know, you see the origin of QAnon is this crazy Pizzagate conspiracy, which suggested that there was, it's really not nice. It's you know, suggesting that Hillary Clinton is keeping children in the basement of a pizza restaurant. And, you know, you can imagine reading that. And, you know, obviously that's going to get a lot of engagement. That's going to get, you know, people are going to comment, people are going to be, yes, you know, kind of like shocked. Some people are going to be like, this is ridiculous, I can't believe this is on the internet. But then that's going to get prioritized. So when those algorithms are thinking about how do we prioritize, you know, the information that people are seeing, that stuff's going to float to the top. So we have that problem. And then we have the problem of advertising. And honestly, if I can say to anyone here who has any advertising budget and wants to grow your the reach of your content, like, do it. Because what's happening is the climate deniers are really, really, really using the fact that a lot of these advertising these advertising channels are super opaque. So Facebook has an ad library. I can go on my favorite denier sites. I can go check out the Global Warming Policy Foundation and see what they're doing. See what they're doing in terms of kind of, I don't know, targeting mums with climate denial. I can see that. I can't see what's happening on Twitter. I can't see what's happening on Reddit. I can't see, you know, what's happening in the programmatic ecosystem. So, but we do know that there's a load of money being spent by organizations who, you know, kind of are climate deniers or climate delayers, you know, targeting people who are susceptible to misinformation. And we've seen it with the net zero conversation, kind of targeting groups that are on lower incomes with messaging that's saying to them, hey, net zero is going to leave you poor and cold, and your grandma won't be able to pay her heating bills. Are you okay with that? Or saying, you know, we must dig because we're in wartime, we must frack. you know, because, you know, kind of fracking will make us great again. And, you know, like, we didn't have that before. We didn't have the opportunities to advertise to people in this way without scrutiny before. And, you know, organisations are taking full advantage of that. And we've got, you know, we've got groups who the climate movement have never spoken to and need to start speaking to, in my opinion. And those groups are the groups that those organisations are targeting, because they're easy to find online. You know, kind of older men in particular, for example, you know, and people from lower income backgrounds. You know, kind of, we know these kind of like, these are people that we must start talking to. We must start helping, you know, we must start talking to them, framing our messaging in ways that they can pick up. Otherwise, they're kind of quite easy, you know, they're quite easy to target for these groups. So we don't have more misinformation necessarily, but the way that the tools that organizations can use to spread it have got, you know, you know, kind of become much more sophisticated. And by the way, there is a whole like business model behind creating misinformation, which is funded by advertising, and that's a whole other rant I could go on. But because this content is so because it moves through the internet so quickly, moves through social platforms, that means it gets lots of views, lots of engagement. And what do you earn money in online advertising from? Content that has views and engagement. So there is literally like a billions of dollars business model behind this. And if it's super profitable for your pundits to stand up and say the earth is flat and climate change is a hoax orchestrated by, I don't know, Hillary Clinton, then that creates weird incentives and people are taking full advantage of that. And that is another reason why the work that I do with the Conscious Advertising Network is trying to help organisations to cut the funding for this kind of like outrageous misinformative content, because it's hugely harmful, but unfortunately it's also hugely lucrative. I'll stop talking there.
Excellent, thank you. And yeah, I think, yeah, it's a good point you make, I think, about the fact that there used to be gatekeepers we could rely on, and now, of course, we can't. And we have to sort of become more proficient at actually sort of countering and engaging with sort of this content in a way which we didn't necessarily have to do sort of 5-10 years ago so much. I guess that brings on to me another question, sort of, which is sort of, you said that media outlets used to be the gatekeepers. Do you think the media outlets and the journalists are more savvy now, or do they need educating on how they are being manipulated? I do remember how much, sort of, for instance, Trump took advantage of literally his ability to get eyeballs sort of on any sort of newspaper to sort of weave his sort of his earworms in there. And I'm wondering if journalists have now started pushing back more, or if we have to actually engage with journalists more to be more accountable.
Yeah, 100%. I think so. It's a difficult one because we've also got, you know, those perverse incentives that I talked about with advertising. Unfortunately, those perverse incentives are also changing the nature of journalism, because you know, if you think about the fact that journalism has lost a lot of money over as you know, as advertising has shifted from direct buys, where, you know, kind of advertising agencies used to have almost personal relationships with publishers, and they could phone them up and say, look, I've got this client, I want a, you know, I want a double page spread advert for this client in your magazine. Now, because we have the internet, and, you know, like, I can be scrolling through Facebook, and I'm getting served one ad, you know, in front of my laptop or my television going, I'm getting served 2 other ads. There's so much more choice, and you know, and unfortunately, up until very recently, the advertising industry has treated, I don't know, cat videos the same, you know, advertising against cat videos, or you know, kind of content about how to get rich quick in 10 steps, the same as like quality news in journalism. And that's created this weird thing where actually proper news is competing with, like, you know, I don't know, like, you know, kind of all of this stuff. And so journalism has had to change, like the way that we present information has had to change in order to kind of actually make sure that people do come back to the news outlets, and, you know, kind of therefore the journalists can kind of earn their keep. So, you know, in some newsrooms, journalists get, you know, kind of are ranked on, you know, just how many visits, how many eyeballs their pieces get. So, you know, that in itself changes the nature of what you want to write about, how you present information. You know, it's led to these clickbait headlines and things like that. So I think that's one thing to be conscious of. I think there's also, you know, I think we've got to get better at engaging journalists and showing the value of good climate reporting. But also that means, like, you know, kind of wrapping this up in things that journalists are reporting on already, because what we see, we know what happens. You know, you've got a journalist who's in the environment section, and we pitch to them, and that's fine, that's good. You know, if we're talking to stakeholders that are, you know, kind of like interested in the environment, fine. If you want to talk to the general public, I think you've got to think differently, and we've got to think much more about how climate change intersects with culture. You know, I come from I'm not from an advertising background per se, but I do work in advertising, and I've just seen the power of advertising also to kind of get our messages kind of directed out. So I definitely think that we have to get better at wrapping these stories up in a way that journalists really engage with and care about, and can see the intersections between climate and our day-to-day lives, so that we don't treat it as something differently. I think there is definitely a knowledge gap around things like cherry picking and, you know, the way that climate misinformation is presented, or can be misrepresented. And, you know, I think one of the really telling things was hearing, I don't know if anyone heard it, Andrew Dessler is a climate scientist at Texas University, and he went on Joe Rogan's podcast after there'd been this huge outcry about Rogan, kind of interviewing these climate deniers, and he really beautifully debunked. If you want a masterclass in fact and fallacy, by the way, this guy is he's just so good. But he talks about, like, this climate denier acting like a defense attorney for carbon dioxide, and it's just great. It's Andrew Dessler is his name, and he's on Joe Rogan, and you know, but Joe Rogan was like, genuinely, he didn't know that you could cherry pick science like this. He was really surprised by a lot of, you know, the thing, and, like, you know, okay, he's not a, you know, kind of like hard-nosed journalist, but you could just see the gap in you know, and this is complex stuff, like, you know, particularly when you're not talking to kind of climate reporters, this is really complex stuff to get your head around. So yeah, I think we need to, you know, I think just like helping journalists understand how they might be being duped around climate is also a big thing. So yeah.
I think that's the link on Spotify to the February 16th, was it? Looks like it's 2 hours and 12 minutes, quite an extensive one there, but you say it's sort of an excellent one to go into on the masterclass on it. That looks great. Okay. Then I have another question, since there aren't any coming from the community, but there will be some, I'm sure. It's always great to hear success stories of these things, because I think often it's like, it's sort of, you know, we have all these things to do, we have to do a bit of this and a bit of that, know how to use it in the right time, and etc. I guess in your experience, what type of success stories do you have in the work you've done that you could share with us, no matter how big or small?
Brilliant, yes. So, I think, you know, one of the biggest, we work with a lot of organisations via the ACT network, and we don't necessarily you know, kind of shout about who those organisations are, but a lot of them are climate NGOs. And one of our members has been using this reframing and the fact and fallacy model in their community management, because they get a lot of kind of conspiracy theories. So their kind of member base, I think sounds like often uses them as a bit of a sounding board for, like, actually I've heard this, and, you know, kind of like, this makes me really concerned about something else. And, you know, so they have this group, they have this kind of community that's strangely, you know, kind of very, very engaged. And so they've been able to use this really, really effectively with their community to, I think, you know, kind of like debunk some of this stuff. You know, they've been able to do it, and they found that people really respond really, really well to this, like, emotional thing, and that they're you know, they're actually getting less, or, you know, kind of less of these kind of like posts around, you know, kind of, I don't know, chemtrails or volcanoes, like not causing climate change and stuff like that. And they're able to kind of like, and they're able to do that. So for us, that's been an amazing thing to hear. I think there's some brilliant examples, and kind of we're working on some at the moment of how you can use kind of small advertising budgets to kind of combat limiting beliefs. So there's a great example from something called the Reality Project, and they did an experiment with Instagram advertising where they were looking at people who had this sense that these people that were kind of passive news consumers that didn't really they don't really kind of get their news from mainstream media outlets. They get a lot of it from Facebook, for example, Instagram, and they were targeting them with just like gentle information about climate change, things like 97% of scientists agree it's happening and it's us. And then they were testing people's kind of knowledge a couple of months later. That's it, the Climate Reality Project. And actually they were able to see that people who'd seen these adverts responded differently to the quizzes, and they knew more about climate change, and they were able to say, actually, we recognise it as a scientific consensus. So there's some great stuff going on there. And then finally, if you've got any, if you want to see something really fun, there's an organisation called Make My Money Matter, and they're all about making sure that our pensions are divested from things like fossil fuels, from arms, etc. And there's a case study on the Creative Brief website for Media Bounty, who's the organisation that I work for day on day, and it's about how they've used advertising actually to increase awareness of this project, but also to kind of increase the number of people that are taking action. So whether it's like community management and just having the tools to be able to respond and prioritize to these threats, or whether it's like kind of taking action to get ahead, there's some great examples of how if we really embrace the reality of like our online world, or embrace the reality of the fact that there are these opportunities to communicate in ways that aren't just PR, then we can kind of actually have richer, we've got a bigger toolbox to call on when it comes to kind of getting our message across, talking to people and bringing people with us. So yeah.
Okay, super for that, and lots of things I actually didn't know about in terms of organizations out there doing some interesting work. So thank you for that as well. So we've been on here now. We're at sort of 1:30 UK time. So this was the time we're scheduled to end. I realize some of you may have to go off. So is there any further last questions sort of we have, or for you, Harriet, is there anything you'd like to sort of ask the people who are here, or that may be watching the video later, or things before we go off?
So on my part, I just wanted to say, the Act for Climate Truth Network, which is some of the stuff that I've taken you through today, it's a free to join network. We would love to, we are a network of organisations. We share tips and learnings on how to tackle misinformation. We're mainly focused on climate, but some of those tips can, kind of have bigger, bigger impact. So if you are, if you do want to come and if you do fancy understanding a little bit more about us, then do get in contact. We are actforclimatetruth.org, or please feel free to get in contact with me directly, and we'd love to talk to you more. So I think the more people that we can get understanding this stuff, kind of looking for it, knowing what we're up against, I think the better kind of conversations we'll have around climate, and the more kind of action that we can take countering misinformation.
Absolutely, and I think this is one of the areas where sort of if you're doing active work on there, there's a lot to learn, not only in the climate space, but for every other type of campaign as well, though climate sort of is the emergency. I guess climate outreach, it must be part of that, because they're doing incredible work around climate communication as well. So
yes.
Yeah.
Climate outreach is fantastic, and anyone who hasn't seen their Britain Talks climate research, you really should, because it's fabulous.
Yeah, let me add a sort of post for that as well. Give a link to that. Okay, I'll add it in a minute. There we go. So I want to thank you very much, Harriet, for your time to sort of come and share with people who are here, and also those who are watching the video as well. I always find that I have so much to learn from everybody else, sharing what they're doing and what successes they're having and the challenges. I also would say there's been some interesting overlap between your presentation and Ed Coper, who wrote a book called Facts and Other Lies. Have you heard of that one?
I have not, but I look forward to finding it on the video.
Yes. So I'm just looking it up right now. He is also active with the e-campaigning forum community, and he's Australian-based. So he talked earlier on the week, and we do have the video. And also the parallels, I think, with what's happening in Ukraine are, and how, for instance, the US and other countries have actually countered some of the disinformation by preempting it and inoculating people and things, is actually a really fascinating case study of all of this stuff in practice, because we can see it operating on a large scale with some really well-funded sort of state actors in opposition, and yeah, so it's it's something which I think is really sort of vibrant and current right now, that we can learn from. So yes, thank you for that. So I've just added the link there where it says sort of, that was his video said it's above. Great. Well, thank you everyone as well for participating sort of online, joining. This video will be up within minutes of us sort of ending the session. Please do share it. People who do want to watch it do need to register, but I'll also be providing it to Harriet in case she wants to edit it, cut and paste it, sort of chop it up into pieces and put it on her own site as well. So, and if any of you else out there want to talk about something and share it with the community, that's also something which we can organize another session around, because there's so much experience in the campaigning forum community. It's amazing sort of all the expertise we can learn from there. So, so thank you, Harriet, for your sort of sharing, and good luck with your work.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for listening.
Okay. Have a good rest of the week. Cheers.